In today's tutorial, we will be having a little bit of 3D fun inside of After Effects where we are going to be creating this exact thing, which is inspired by a tweet I saw, and I just thought it would be super fun to do some 3D stuff in After Effects, working with some text. And we're also going to be adding some of our very own source, thanks to Revopoint, who've been kind enough to send over the Range 2 3D scanner, which we will be using to create some 3D models. Not only does the Range 2 3D scanner let you scan smaller items like a paper ball that we'll be doing later on, but you can also scan larger items like a person or even a cat tree. You can scan directly to your computer or on your phone, whichever one works best for you, and then you can export them as OBJ files and send them to your computer or wherever else you need them. And you can even take them into Blender and create some really sick things, or into After Effects like we will be doing later in this video. Don't forget to join the Range 2 Facebook group. In the community, they'll be sharing the latest Range 2 showcases and hosting interactive giveaway events. But without further ado, let's hop straight into the tutorial where I have a 1920 by 1080 composition set up at 24 frames per second. We are going to start off very simple. We are going to create a background, so hit Command Y to create a new solid, and then we can type in background to make sure we name our layers, and I'll just make this whatever color, doesn't matter, because we are going to be adding a gradient wrap using FX Console, free plugin linked in the description. I just want this to be a very subtle gradient, a very light one. We're going to add maybe a little bit of warmth and a brownish orangish color, and then on the other end of the spectrum just a little bit of a cooler color by introducing a little bit of purple. Just a slight lavender color will look pretty good, and I'll place one point right there, and I'll place the other point over here, and then we can kind of play around with it to get a look we think looks pretty cool. And I think this looks pretty smooth, just a very subtle gradient. Next up, we are going to add some text. I'm going to start by selecting my text tool up here, and let's type in something very simple like. And let's change the font to Latino Gothic, which is just a super nice thick font with a lot of character to it, which is perfect for this. And I'll just center this up right in the middle, and that is plenty good for the beginning of our text. I'm gonna pre-comp this layer by hitting Shift Command C and just name this like pre and hit enter. Then in my project overview, I'm gonna drag that pre-comp into the pre-comps folder to keep our project nice and organized. Going into this layer, we can start playing around a little bit. I am gonna right click on the layer, go to create shapes from text, and that'll just give us some shape layers to work with. And then using motion tools, which is another free plugin, I'm gonna use the extract shapes feature, which is just put each letter in its own layer, so it makes it a little bit easier to work with. So I'm gonna click that, and that gives us this. Now I'm gonna go forward a little bit to about, let's say, 2 seconds. And I'm gonna, while everything is selected, I'm gonna search for path and keyframe all these paths. So that will just give us a little bit to play with, and then I'm gonna hit P as well with everything selected, and then keyframe the position as well. I'm gonna hit U to show all my keyframes, and I'm gonna go back to about a second, and we're just gonna do a little bit of a beginning animation here. And all I wanna do here is just take some of these paths and positions and move them around a little bit to create a little bit of a stretched text, kind of like we did in some of the other tutorials that we've done before, and maybe go back a little bit more, then click on the path again and maybe stretch it out in a little bit of a different way, just adding a little bit more character to it. And then the position, take that and slide it off the screen, kind of like that. And then go back to about 12 frames and then move around some of the other letters. And this is just a place where you can have a whole bunch of fun, just kind of whatever you feel like doing. Then we can take all these keyframes and we can apply sexy speed. If you're interested in these flow presets, they are available on my Patreon as well as the project file, so you can always go in and get that if you are interested in playing around with the files themselves. But playing that back, we now have something that looks kind of like this. A little bit slow, so we're gonna tighten up some of the timing of it a little bit. Let's start with this eye, and we can select all these keyframes, and then by holding Alt and clicking and dragging these, we can change the distance between the keyframes. So snapping that in is just gonna make it a little bit sharper of an animation. And we might even take this and just move the position up a little bit. So we have this nice little snappy animation here. Let's take the L and we're gonna snazzy that up a little bit too, make that nice and quick. Same with the K and the E as well. And now we just want to move them around a little bit to make it look a little bit interesting. We definitely want the K coming in before the E so they don't overlap. And then we can take the E and just move it in a little bit closer so that we kind of get a little bit of that movement right there. So this looks pretty good for the beginning of our text. And once we have it animated in like this, I want to go forward a couple of frames right about here, and I'm going to hit U, and I'm going to take my shape layers and I am going to split it all up, and then I'm going to move these layers above, And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to turn these into a little bit of a 3D animation. We can hit U to show all the keyframes, and we can just delete all that because we don't need any of these. So I'm going to take these layers and I'm going to turn 3D on for all of them. And then I want to make sure that I'm using the advanced 3D renderer because that will allow us to get some extrusion. You can also use the Cinema 4D renderer. It doesn't matter too much. I don't know exactly what the difference is, but either one will work for this as long as it's not classic 3D. If you don't see this tab down here while in your composition, you can always hit Command K, and that'll bring up the 3D renderer where you can change it to any which mode. You can search for extrusion, and I want to keyframe all of it. And then I'm going to go forward to about, let's say 12 frames and set it all to maybe around 40. And if you need to see how thick your text is, you can always open to view mode, which will then allow you to see the extrusion, and maybe you can turn it to a left view over here so you can see how thick your text is. And it just gives it a nice little animation here by extruding it. And let's go back into one view mode with all the layers selected. You can hit P to bring up the position, and also Shift R to bring up the rotation, and keyframe it for all of these layers. Now we can go forward to, let's say, 2 seconds and 12 frames. And the idea here is we are going to use our 3D model in just a little bit. We'll do that towards the end. But essentially we want to use that as an impact, and then we want to create a couple of floating shapes as if they're floating away. So what I'm going to do here is just play around with the rotation a little bit. We don't want it to look too perfect, but we just want it to move up and away, kind of like it's been hit by something. So just play around with the rotation until you get something that looks pretty random. That is, I'd say the most important part is you just want it to look like it's been hit by something. And I think that looks pretty good for getting a little bit of a random look. As you can see now, it just stops at this animation, but we can actually add an expression to keep this movement flowing without us having to add anything extra movement. So by alt clicking on any one of these, we can add the loop out expression, and then inside of the parentheses, we'll add the little bunny ears and then add the continue type. And that'll just carry out the momentum of the keyframes until it just keeps going. And it depends on the easing. So let's say you were to ease these keyframes, then that would affect how it animates out. So with the sexy speed, because it's so slow at the end, you can see it's a very minimal movement. So by keeping the keyframes uneased, it keeps the momentum flowing, and then we can always adjust it by adding a time remap effect to the pre-comp itself. So I'm gonna right click on this and copy the expression and paste it onto all of the parameters just so it keeps going and going and going. Just looks a little bit cool and gives it that floaty feel. Then if we hit U just to hide all the keyframes and play it back to full screen, we have something that looks kind of like this, which looks pretty cool. Just adds a little bit of extrusion as it's kind of floating out, which I think looks pretty cool. But let's take these first letters and we'll change the color to a white color. So just set that to a white color. And then for the other ones, we are also going to change the color to white, but we are going to add just a little bit of extra flavor in here by opening up the individual letters and then go into contents and then click on one of the letters, go to add, whatever side you want to change, you can change the color of it. So in this case, we are going to change the side color, and it'll just let us change the color here. So you can see it's red right here, and we'll just pick some pretty bright colors and kind of go in maybe a little bit of a gradient from like a pinkish to an orangey over here. Now we have all the colors added, but as you can see, we have some of the lighting affecting and all that stuff. If we want to maybe make it look a little bit nicer, so if I hit U twice to hide everything, we can right click, go to new, and then pick a light, and maybe we'll set a ambient light and set the brightness up a good bunch. And then we can always hit Shift Command Y to bring up the settings and play around with just how bright it is. Set it to some maybe 100 to get some nice flat lighting, just so it matches the colors of all that. And just looks pretty cool just having a little bit of a color pop in there as well. But that is pretty much it for this. We can go back into our main composition, and now we have this nice little text animation. Next step is to add our little paper ball that I was talking about, where I scanned myself using the Range 2 scanner from Revopoint, which is super awesome. Revopoint have been kind enough to send over the new Range 2 3D scanner. It lets you scan real world objects on your phone or on your computer. The updated Range scanner features single frame precision up to 0.1 millimeters and single frame accuracy up to 0.3 millimeters with a 400 to 1300 millimeter working distance. This makes it super easy to get clean scans. Additionally, the full flash LED lighting system allows for clean color capture. My favorite part of this is probably the efficiency, since it scans up to 16 frames per second. Once you have the scans, you can use the software RevoScan 5, where you can make adjustments and clean up your scans. For it to work in After Effects, it needs to be a special format that Adobe After Effects can read. So in this case, I took the OBJ file into Blender, and then I used Blender to export it as a GLTF file. And you can simply drag this into your composition, and you'll have to say okay, and it'll automatically change it to an advanced 3D composition. So you can't work with this and maybe something classic 3D, which we're going to be doing a little bit later. So just make sure you pre-comp all your items just so they, it kind of works in the sense that you need it to. The concept here is pretty simple. We want to animate this ball kind of flying in, but to help a little bit with selling some of that movement, we're going to add a camera. And so we're gonna right click, go to new camera, and then we are gonna set it to a 20mm camera. This is gonna give us some nice distortion around the edges. So as the ball flies in, it's gonna look really, really sick. But in the ball, you can hit P and Shift R to bring up the position and the rotation, and maybe even Shift S to bring up the scale, because we don't need it to be so big. Maybe about this size is pretty good for the ball. And then we can keyframe the position and all the rotations. And then we're just gonna go back a little bit, and you can just move it out to one of the sides and then move it way closer to the camera. Kind of play around with it until you get something that's looking like it's coming out from the sides, something like that. And then if you play that back, you can see you get some of that nice distortion in there from the wide angle. And you can even go ahead and play with some of these handles for your position animation so that it just gets a little bit of extra movement in there. And then of course you want it to rotate, so you just spin these back a whole bunch until you get something that kind of looks like a ball that's being thrown, just to sell the movement of it a little bit more. Might add a little bit of easing to it by hitting F9 to add some easing. And then I want the impact to be pretty tough, pretty hard right at the end. So I'm gonna move these keyframes over a little bit so that we get more impact towards the end, just very basic, and move that in, and then just a slight bit of impact towards the end I think looks pretty cool. And we can just duplicate this and do a couple of different versions of this just to add a little bit more emphasis. So duplicate it, hit U, and you can just delete that position keyframe, go back a little bit and maybe move it out a different way, and maybe have this one come a little bit down. And then we will play around with this to come in kind of like that, and move that one back. And playing that back, we now have something that looks kind of like that. So we have the paper balls hitting it and kind of getting the text to explode. But then we can hit U, and then we will go into our pre-comp with the light text. We're gonna right click on it and then go to time, enable time remapping. But essentially what we're gonna do here, we're gonna go forward until right where it's close to starting. So let's say right here, we're gonna keyframe it. And then we're gonna go forward a little bit to where the balls land. And that's where we kind of want the impact to start. So maybe add another keyframe a little bit before, maybe right here, go forward to here. And then we want the letters to go out a little bit more like that. So we just get a little bit more impact there, and we can ease these keyframes as well. Let's add a sexy speed, and then playing that back, we now have something that looks kind of like that. And we might want to adjust this just a little bit so we get this exactly. I think that is gonna look pretty good. And then we can just let it go forever and ever. And you can always adjust the timing of this if you want it to go further away or not. But we're not gonna need these for super long because we will be transitioning to the next scene. After they fly out here, boom, we are gonna cut these two paper balls because we don't need them anymore. And boom, that looks pretty good. We have that coming in, maybe offset them just a little bit. So one paper ball comes in just a little bit before the other one, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. We can pre-comp the paper balls, and we wanna make sure that we bring the camera with it, of course. So Shift Command C, and then this paper balls pre, and then we wanna make sure we drag that into our pre-comps folder, and maybe just add a hue and saturation because it has some weird colors in there, and just decrease that to make it black and white. So that is pretty good for our first scene here. We have the paper ball smashing in and the letters flying. And let's say right about here, we want to trim both these layers. And then we are going to do our second version of animating some 3D text. It's going to be a bit different. We are going to start with the text, and it works best if you have text that you can split up into even amounts, especially if you're working with a monospace font. That'll work the best, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to start by typing in sub. I'm going to be typing out subscribe, which you should do, by the way. And I'm gonna pick a monospace font. In this case, Azure Mono. It looks pretty good. I think this one is pretty well. I'm gonna make sure I center it up, and I want it to make sure that it is center aligned, the text, so when we type the next part of the word, it's gonna be the same thing. And we can trim this layer up right here and scale it down just a little bit and center it back up. And then we're gonna take our shape layer tool, and we wanna make sure we set the color to something, just whatever for now, and that we enable stroke, and the stroke is just gonna be 3 pixels is fine. And I'm just going to draw a little bit of a rectangle here that will cover the whole text and place it behind our text. So we know exactly how much white space we're working with on either side. And maybe while the layer is selected, search for size, unlink it, and just scale it down to a rough number. So maybe 265. and then 130 in the height, which is just gonna make it a little bit easier when we start actually turning it into a 3D model. We can trim this layer first and then select both our layers, so the text and the box, Shift-Command-C to pre-comp it, and let's do this left pre, and then we can open up that pre-comp, and now we can start having some fun. We are gonna start by creating a gradient on our fill, so click the fill text and then change it to a gradient type, and just adjust these a little bit, and we're gonna create 4 different sides which are gonna have a gradient, and then 2 sides on either edge to make like the cap of our little box. So change this to whatever color you want it to be. Let's start with a pretty light color one, like a light grayish that maybe goes into a little bit of a bluish color up here. Then you want to duplicate that, change the gradient of it to something else, just make it look pretty sweet, you know, just whatever you want to do, you can do it as long as it looks cool. That's kind of the only requirement here. And then what we can do next is take our text and we will duplicate it 4 times for each one of the sides, and select all the layers by hitting Command A and then enable 3D. And this time we want to make sure that we work in the classic 3D, which is gonna allow us to keep that gradient and just make it look super nice. Anyways, what we need to do now is partner up these text layers with each one of the shapes, which is gonna make it a little bit easier down the line when we start rotating. So you're gonna take one text and parent it to the shape layer, and just keep doing that for each one of them until every single text layer is parented to a shape layer. Then we can take a shape layer, let's start with the second one here, just hide all of this, and then we can move the keyframe, or the anchor point, sorry, move it, let's say, to the top, and then go into 2 view mode and hit R to bring up the rotation, and then you can set the X rotation to 90, and if we change the second screen to a custom view 1, we can then rotate it around. And then for the text layer here, we can just spin this around if we center the anchor point up right there, and then we can spin this around to get it to be the right angle. So setting that to 180 looks pretty fine, but essentially it's the same process for all of this. So if you reveal the next one and move the anchor point down this time, again using motion tools, and then hit R to bring up the rotation, and then you want to flip this the opposite way of what we just did, so that would be -90. And using the orbit tool, again, we can make sure that our text looks just fine. So select that text, center up the anchor point, hit R to bring up the rotation, and set that to 180 so that it is readable the right way. Then we have the final one, which is going to be our backboard, and we will set that position, we'll just move it back, so that looks pretty good right there. And then if we go back to 1 view mode, we can create our little rectangle here. So I'm just going to select a rectangle, change the fill to a solid color and change it to a black, and just click and hold shift while you drag it out to make it whatever size. And then the good thing is we have the size right in here, so we know that if we search it up, you can see the size is 130 on the shorter side, which is the size we need it to be. So if you go into your new square, you can type it in and then just type in 130, and that'll be the exact size we need. Center that bad boy up, turn it into 3D, and rotate it 90 degrees on the Y rotation, and move it out to the side, duplicate it, and move it out to the other side. If you then go back into your main composition where you have this set up, and you enable 3D on this layer, and then turn on collapse transformations, very important, we now have a 3D cube in here, which is perfect. So now we can spin that around and get all the text that we need. Super awesome. Of course, make sure you change this to classic 3D, very important, otherwise it's gonna look very weird. Bada bing, bada boom, we have a nice little cube, and we wanna make sure that these sides are actually lined up, because right now they are not. So we wanna take these and move them back a little bit till they are perfectly lined up. And then if we go back, we now have the anchor point at the very front, and you wanna make sure that in here you turn it into 3D and collapse transformations to get the actual 3D shape of it. You can move the anchor point by and then hitting Y, and then you can always move it, or you can type in the exact value that you know you want it to be. So in the anchor point, we know that it's 130 and then divided by 2, which is then 65, and that'll place it right in the middle. So now when we rotate it, it'll rotate around the anchor point to give us a perfect rotation. Now that we have this first one set up, it's super easy for us to duplicate it 2 more times, especially using a monospace font. We'll simply go into our project overview and of course drag this into the pre-comps folder, and then open that up, and then we want to duplicate it from in here, which is going to create a true duplicate. Otherwise, it'll just change it in all the pre-comps. Press Command D up here to duplicate it, and then we'll click on it and then hit Command K and change this to middle pre. Set it to 1 view mode, and then for each of these text instances, you simply want to change the text to be your next bit of text. So in this case, we'll type scr is the next couple letters. This step does require a little bit of knowing how to spell, and then going back into the main comp, you can simply drag that in here, and now we have an extra box, and you want to drag that up to line up with that. Same step, take the middle, duplicate it, open it up, Command K to rename it, change this to write pre, and the last bit of text is IB, and this just makes it a lot easier if you have to repeat this step or make any changes, rather than turning the shapes into uneditable layers, etc. So this is probably one of the easiest ways you can make this easily editable. And again, we will drag that in here. So now we have all three, line them up, and just make sure you set the rotation of this back to 0. You do want to change the anchor point of these, so you can select both of them, hit A, and make sure you enable 3D, and then collapse transformations, and then in the anchor point, set that to the same as this one, which is 65. Now we can take these and place them next to one another. So left, we will move that out to the left by just clicking and dragging and holding shift, move it out that way, and this one, move it out this way. You can decide however you want this to be, if you want them to be exactly next to one another, or if you want it to be kind of, you know, wherever you want it to be. TV mode, and we just want to make sure these are lined up to 0, and that looks pretty good. And all I want to do now is change the rotation of them a little bit as the starting point. So if I hit R to bring up the rotation, I'm just going to spin this a couple of times. Maybe this one we'll do -90. For the middle one, let's do -180. And then we can keep the first one as is, just to keep it nice and different. And looks like we forgot to change the name of one of these. We can just go in and change that really quick. The black text doesn't work very well on the black background, so we can always go in and just change the color of that one, which I think is this one. Change the text color to a white color, for example, and go back in, and just like that, you have it changed. Makes it super easy to work with. You can even add gradients, whatever you want to, however you want to stylize this. Let's take these, and then we're gonna go forward to about right here, I'd say, keyframe the X rotation, and then I'm gonna go back and move the X rotation back a little bit, and I'm just gonna randomize it just a little bit, just to get a little bit of, first it kind of comes down, and then we're gonna go forward, and then we're gonna send it backwards right there. So now we get this little, comes in and then boom, and I think that looks pretty cool. We can take these and hit F9 to add some easing. Now maybe you want to stretch this out just a little bit first, just so it's not super crazy. Take these and go in here, and let's take all of these keyframes and ease them so that it starts coming in with a lot of momentum here, and then slowly backs out this way. Maybe move these keyframes out that way so that we just get a little bit of hesitation almost right there. One way you can spice this up a little bit if you want to is by adding a little bit of a twist to it. I've done a tutorial on the time displacement before on how you can use it in text animations, but you can actually do something similar in order to create a little bit of a twisting motion like you would be able to in a 3D program. It's super simple. You can create a new adjustment layer by hitting Shift Option Command Y, and then add a time displacement effect to it, obviously. And we can just trim this layer up to start right here. And then we are gonna click off and create a new layer by hitting Command Y, and we're just gonna name this displacement map, hit OK, add a gradient ramp to it, and set the first value to 0 or whatever kind of comp you're working with, the second one to 540 to get it right in the center, and over here we're gonna set it to 1920 and 540 over here as well to get it in the other side. And we can swap the colors because time displacement reads it from left to right, so that just looks the best depending on which way you want it to twist, of course. And then we're going to pre-comp this and move all attributes into the new composition, and just rename this to displacement map pre. Again, take your pre-comp and put it in the pre-comps folder. Then we can hide this layer because we actually don't need it anymore. Go into your time displacement and then change the time displacement layer to the displacement map, and just enable effects and masks. You don't have to since we pre-comped it. And we can set the time displacement to something like 0.5 maybe, or 0.1 might even look a little bit better. And then increase the resolution a whole bunch to something like 600. And that'll just make it a lot smoother so we don't have those big chunks. This is a little bit render intensive, especially when it's that high. But as you can see, we now get a twisty motion instead of just a flat straight one. And now we have something that looks kind of like this. Nice little explosion coming in, and a nice twisty box, which just looks Super sweet. You don't have to do it, but you can. I think it looks super awesome. Now there's only a little bit of sauce left to add really. We've got some pretty solid things to work with. I want to add a little bit more of background flair to this one in particular, or just the whole sequence in total. So I'm gonna go into my shape layer, go into the star tool, and I'm just gonna click and drag and draw out a pretty big star, maybe not that big, put it down here. Open up the polystar things, open up the polystar path, change the amount of points into something with a little bit more oomph. You can change the inner radius and outer radius until you get a shape you think looks pretty cool as a detail shape. I think this looks pretty awesome, and I'm gonna click the fill and add a gradient to it just because I think that'll look pretty good, and remove the stroke. I'm just gonna adjust this gradient until we get a nice little gradient piece here and place it in the background. And then maybe we are gonna add a bit of a shape layer here, just a square one, and place it right in the middle here, like a nice big rectangle. Place it in the middle and change it to a black and a white gradient. So I'm just gonna change this to a white, change this to a black, and hit V, adjust it a little bit until you get something that looks pretty sweet. And then you can add a solid composite to this and just set that to white. And then if you hide that, and then on the adjustment or on our shape layer, we can add a camera lens blur and then set the layer to the shape layer we just made, effects and masks. And you can increase the blur a little bit until you see kind of the results of your labor. And in this case, we want to invert the blur map so that it blurs the black areas. You can see we get a nice little look here, kind of like it's a little bit of a gloss thing almost. And the last step to really selling this effect is duplicating your shape layer. You can just drag this right above the shape and we will show this one. And remove the solid composite, and then right click on this layer and then go to layer styles and do a bevel and emboss. And then in the blending options, go to advanced blending, turn the opacity, the fill opacity almost all the way down, go into the bevel and emboss and just decrease the shadow opacity a little bit, just because we don't need it to be that bright. It just gives a little bit of highlight up there. You can always change that, play around with it until you get a pretty nice look. I think maybe 90 degrees is gonna look pretty good. And then decrease the shadow just a little bit more, just so it's barely there. And that just gives us a little bit of a gloss look almost. I think that looks super, super sweet. Then you can always change the gradient of it as well. If you go in and hit that to bring up that, and then maybe set the top bit to be a little bit darker, the bottom bit to be a little bit lighter. Just give it a little bit more flair. I think that looks super sweet. Then we can hit add an adjustment layer, add a Posterize Time because that looks always sick. Below it, add a solid by hitting Command Y and name this grain. And we want to make sure that we have 80-80-80 set as the hex code. Add the add grain effect and change it to a final output. And then in preset, do maybe a codec vision 250D, size 1.3, softness 1.3, add a tint effect. Very important this step. Pre-comp it, make sure move all attributes into the new composition, rename this grain pre, and set that to overlay for a nice little grainy look in there. Just looks super spicy. Now there's only one last effect that I want to add to this, which is gonna bring the spice up a whole bunch, and that is a halftone effect. So below our grain, I'm gonna add an adjustment layer, and I'm gonna add BCC halftone, which is a paid plugin, but super sick. There's an affiliate link in the description as well if you are interested in getting it. It's part of the Sapphire plugin. And I'm gonna change it to RGB to keep the colors in there, and then just adjust this a little bit until we get a nice halftone texture in there. You can even play around with the contrast and the brightness until you get a look that you think looks pretty sweet. I think this looks super awesome, especially in the gradients and the blurs. Just look, chef's kiss, love it. And maybe even just to spice it up a little bit on our shape layer down here, make sure your anchor point is centered, and then just add an expression to the rotation by hit Alt and Alt clicking the rotation, and then do a time times 10, which will just give it a tiny little spin as it goes along. We will end the composition right here, and we will also end the video right here, because that is pretty much all I have for today's video. Just a little bit of 3D animation inside of After Effects, creating some super sick motion graphics with text, which is probably my favorite thing. I just love text animations. Shout out to Revopoint for sending out the Range 2 3D scanner, which is super awesome. Basically unlimited 3D models at your fingertips. You can scan paper balls like I did, or you can even scan yourself and make something really cool with that. I just want to say thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you feel inspired to create something new. Again, if you are interested in the project file, it'll be available on Patreon. But yeah, I'll see you again next week. Peace out.